Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 26th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and we'll be discussing a weird weekend of racing, looking back at Saturday and Sunday. We had some major upsets at the fairgrounds, some new play, three-year-old division that will be major forces moving on to the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks. And we'll dive right in to discuss the Louisiana Derby cards, as well as the undercard races on that card, and the Sunland Park Derby and some of the undercard races on that card, as well as some Oak preps that took place at the fairgrounds and Sunland Park last weekend. So I'll go right ahead and welcome in my co-host, Craig Milkowski, the TimeformUS Chief Speed Figure Maker. Craig, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Beautiful day here in Oklahoma City, so I'm ready to go. No more complaining about the cold this year.
Nice. I'm recording from my visiting my father this weekend in Pennsylvania, so if you hear dogs barking in the background, that's coming from my end. We'll start by looking at the fairgrounds card from Saturday. And the big race, obviously, was the Louisiana Derby, which featured a major upset. War of Will, who was the heavy favorite coming into that race off impressive wins in the Lecompte and the Risen Star, just didn't show up. He had a rough start. Something obviously happened. There are some reports that he pulled a muscle coming out of the gate. He was just not himself, and we had a major upset with By My Standards coming off a maiden win to get the victory.
Yeah, it was definitely a weird race with War of Will. For those that follow me on Twitter, you may have seen the picture. I was actually doing some timing of the races, mainly for a race we'll talk about later, the New Orleans Handicap. But I timed the Derby just to be sure, and it just so happened that where I froze the picture where timing began, you could see a really awkward position that Will's legs are in at the time. I'm far from an expert on how horses are supposed to run and what their action's supposed to look like. But even to me, this stuck out like a sore thumb. So hopefully he recovers. I really don't. I've read that he seems to be doing okay. I wasn't a big fan of his going in, and I actually bet against him, not successfully. But it's hard to take credit. You can't really judge a horse like that off this race. By my standards, he jumped up off that maiden win, which seemed to be the theme this weekend for the two Derby preps. All it took was a maiden win. He ran a decent 117 TimeformUS speed figure, and to be honest, that just kind of lumps him in with everyone else in all these preps that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I definitely think that there were some things going on at the start of this race that really changed the result. Going in, I wasn't really sure what to make of War of Will's performances in the Lecompte and the Risen Star, because I've been a fan of this horse, but he's the one that really needed to step forward in this spot and run a faster speed figure. And obviously that didn't happen with what transpired coming out of the gate. I agree with you. I don't know what was really going on in his hind end. It just seemed like the ground broke away from him and his legs were in a really awkward position. It's no surprise to hear that there was some sort of muscle strain coming out of that race. And it's just good news that there was nothing structurally wrong after he really took an awkward step there. But his performance, he was just a non-factor. And I think it really changed the race because the pace that we kind of expected to develop never really came to fruition. They weren't going that slowly up front, but the pace was on the moderate side. And I think you saw horses that were up close to the pace throughout really dominate the race. Spinoff, who finished second in this spot, was in a good stalking position throughout this race. And By My Standards got in a perfect trip from Gabriel Saez, just stalking on the inside in about fourth position for the entire race, and he came through and just angled out at the top of the stretch and was able to get the victory. By My Standards kind of has a weird pedigree. He's by Golden Sense. His dam was mostly a turf horse who kind of excelled going sprint distances, but could go as far as a mile and a 16th. So he was a horse that had no trouble getting the 9 furlongs. We'll see if he really wants to go the 1.25 miles when they stretch him out to the Kentucky Derby in his next start. But he's obviously doing well right now, and this 3-year-old picture is so wide open. I'm not going to be surprised if a horse like him can go on and step up to the bigger races moving ahead.
Yeah, and kind of interesting with Spinoff. I mean, I think it could be argued he ran the better race. As you know, By My Standards had an absolutely perfect trip. Where Spinoff, he was a little wide. He showed a little more speed. And the interesting thing with him is we hadn't heard the name Todd Pletcher much at all before this weekend in the Tampa race. And all of a sudden, he has 3 horses who were probably in the gate on the first Saturday in May.
Yeah, it's a good point. Todd Pletcher had that drought of not winning any graded stakes races with this crop of 3-year-olds, and that was obviously broken on Sunday in the Sunland Park Derby. But before that, Spinoff almost won the Louisiana Derby and obviously has guaranteed himself a spot in that race, the Kentucky Derby moving on. we'll see if he's a horse that really wants the distance moving forward. His Dam Zaftig was a really brilliant miler. He's by hard spun, so I'm not sure he's one that's really going to appreciate added ground, but he obviously ran fast enough in this race that he's in the conversation. I think that's a good segue to move on to the Sunland Park Derby, which happened on Sunday. And as we were mentioning, Todd Pletcher won that race with Cutting Humor, who just held off another Twist of Fate to win that race. They were far ahead of the rest of the field. This race, I think, is interesting to discuss from a speed figure perspective because the final time was dazzlingly fast. I believe they set a track record in this race going the mile and an eighth in 1:46 and 4. But I think you have to take the times at Sunland Park with a grain of salt, and I think our speed figure reflects that.
Yeah, it was crazy fast on Sunday at Sunland. And the other thing is that I broke this race out from the other races. It was the only race run at a mile and an eighth. And frankly, if I used the variant for the other races that I used for this one, all these horses would have suddenly been looking like the favorites going into the Kentucky Derby from a figure standpoint. And I just didn't buy it. And it's not just because of the top two finishers. I mean, I looked through the whole field. We had a lot of local horses. The top four were all shippers, but then the bottom, the next, group of horses were local horses who, if I use that same variant, would have just ran huge lifetime tops, and I just didn't buy it at all. And seeing how this was the only mile and an eighth race, I decided to treat it separately. And I also think run-up played a part. For some reason, Sunland decided to change their run-ups this weekend from what they generally use. They usually use longer ones, but they cut them way back to shorter one. Not way back, but, 10, 20 yards. And in this case, like, you can watch the mile races and you can see they're basically starting right on top of the finish line. It's a mile track, so very little run up. And I think the mile and an eighth race had longer than all the others. And so I had no problem breaking it out. I wasn't going to give Cutting Humor a 125 or whatever it was because I just don't buy it at all. I don't like doing that, but I think it's very legit in this case. And I think the 112 he earned is pretty much spot on.
Out of curiosity, did the run-ups affect the pace figures for this race? Would they be a little bit higher than we would normally expect due to that? Or did you account for that when you were making the pace determinations for this race?
Yeah, I did account for it. It's kind of, usually I absolutely use the run-up and I use different baselines for different run-ups. But since these were new this weekend, I just kind of had to kind of adjust them the best I could based on experience and up the pace figures a little bit for the races with shorter run-ups. So I do try to take that into account. It was a really weird thing. I mean, why a track would suddenly do that? They've been using the same run-ups for as long as I have data back to 2004. So pretty frustrating situation for us speed figure guys if you're into that sort of thing. But you just deal with what you're given. The tracks, I'm sure they must have had some reason to do it. What it is, I don't know. But you just do the best you can with what you have, and that's what I did here.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the fractions of this race compared to the other route races at Sunland Park on Sunday because they did seem unusually fast for the Sunland Park Derby, especially compared to some of the slower paces that we saw in races like the Sunland Park Oaks and the Harry Henson, which we'll get to. Those races just featured far more moderate to slow paces. I don't know what to make of the top two finishers coming out of this race. I was really skeptical of another Twist of Fate coming in. To me, he just seemed like more of a turf horse. He has a real turf reaction to his stride, and the dam side pedigree for him is all turf. So I was kind of skeptical of him becoming a real Derby threat. Maybe that changes out of this race. I still want to see more of both of these horses, even Cutting Humor, who won the race. I know that Todd Pletcher is an expert at getting these horses to the Kentucky Derby, but his prior form just didn't suggest he had this kind of forward move in him. His race in the Southwest, it was hard to find an excuse for it because, while he did make a wide move that day, that race really featured an outside flow, and we saw a long-priced winner come from the outside. So I don't think the trip really is a total excuse for his poor effort that day, and he was no match for Bourbon War in his prior start at Gulfstream Park against Allowance Company. So for me, it's hard to view Cutting Humor as a player at the top of this division now, just off this one race at Sunland Park. And, frankly, we've seen this show before. We've seen some fast times coming out of Sunland Park. And the only horse I can really remember who went on to do anything in the Kentucky Derby out of this race was Firing Line. And to me, he's kind of the exception to the rule and not a predictive horse to use moving forward as an example.
Yeah, Mine That Bird did actually win the Derby out of this race, but
That's a good point.
I think he ran third
Yeah.
in the Sunland Park race, but he didn't run particularly fast that day. So it's not like he came out of some huge figure race there like Firing Line did, where I think pretty much everybody had that as a fast race. My opinion, I would be shocked if any of these horses hit the board in the Derby. Another twist of fate. He ran a 111 on synthetic, a 112 here. Mucho Gusto ran a 108. And he was battling through pretty fast fractions. Even accounting for the fast track, it was still 140 some pace figure. So he was doing some serious work up front, but we do give some extra credit for that. But his 108 that he ran kind of is in line with what he's been running, right around the 110, 112 range. So, the field, the group of Derby preps we've seen, it's all kind of bunched up near the top. They all have similar figures, but this one's just a cut below, and I'm not a fan of any of these. Looks like a grade 3 group to me.
I agree. I think this is going to be a divisive race moving forward. I saw that Bayer had the number a little bit higher. Just looking at the Bayer figures for the race, there was a 27-point spread between this race and the Oaks, and I think we just had a 15-point spread. To me, the numbers for this race that you gave makes a lot of sense. It just makes sense for the horses, their prior form coming into the race, and I had trouble believing that Cutting Humor would have run quite as fast as the speed figure improvement that the Bayers have him going. But you never really know. We don't have a whole lot of evidence with these horses because they're so lightly raced, and the next race will tell us a lot more, but the next race is going to be the Kentucky Derby, so it's going to be difficult for us all to analyze this race moving on. But I think there'll be some differing opinions about these horses coming out of here. Both of us are a little bit skeptical. Moving on to the Oaks preps, the Fairgrounds Oaks was run on Saturday on the Louisiana Derby undercard, and another big upset in this race, kind of like War of Will not showing up. Serengeti Empress didn't show up in this race, and she did have an excuse coming out of this as well. Tom Emos said that she bled in this race, and to me that excuse makes a lot of sense because for the first half of this race, she looked like she was just going to air as she did in the Rachel Alexandra. I mean, she was moving so easily up front. She had her ears pricked forward, looked like she was doing it without much trouble. And then all of a sudden at the quarter pole, she just was completely out of horse. It was really surprising to see that. And this excuse kind of shed some light on what may have happened.
Yeah, it just, man, shows what a tough game this can be. You had two heavy favorites, and whether you like them or not, I mean, it's hard to predict that one's going to get injured, during the race, one's going to bleed. And like you said, she was cruising through, seemingly pretty easy fractions. I mean, it's not like the winners came from way back. They were just kind of sitting a few lengths off of her. Street band for Larry Jones, who used to be an automatic bet for me at Fairgrounds. Not sure why I got away from that with these filly races. But, in the end, it turned out a slow race, which has kind of been the theme for all these Oaks preps. The winner got a 102. Was the only horse to crack triple digits in here. So I'm not sure what to take out of this one. I'd like to say that, I could write him off, but given the state of the division outside of Bellafina, who's, I think, running next week, who has run fairly fast so far, we just haven't seen a whole lot of quality.
Yeah, it's a good point. Kind of going through these races, I was about to say that these are not horses that I want moving on to the Kentucky Oaks. But before I wanted to make that statement, I went to look back at the speed figures that we've earned so far on the Oaks Trail, and they just haven't been that impressive. As you were saying, only Bellafina's run a really respectable number that you would expect of grade 1 type fillies at this time of year. And I think there are questions about how far she really wants to go. So it's a really muddled picture right now moving on to the Kentucky Oaks. And a horse like Street Band, normally she wouldn't be one that I would consider a major contender in that race, but we've got to see who moves on. If Jaywalk can come back in the final prep, if Serengeti Empress can make it to the Oaks and rebound with a better race, we don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. I do want to give credit to Sophie Doyle for a perfect ride on this filly as she just saved ground the entire way around the track, waited patiently at the top of the stretch, and just kind of trusted that this filly would get the distance and run them down in the final quarter mile on that long stretch at the fairgrounds. So I thought she ran well for her in the context of her career. I just don't really know if she's the traditional kind of Kentucky Oaks filly that we would picture coming out of the fairgrounds as a leading contender. I think it's hard to say that at this point. And Larry Jones, it's kind of funny. Larry Jones has been kind of quiet for a few years. I haven't really thought of him as having any major horses on either the Derby or the Oaks Trail. Obviously, he had that horse that coming out of Oaklawn, whose name is escaping me now, who won the Southwest, and he's off the trail now. but hasn't had many horses that have kind of been at the top of their divisions in the past few years, whereas going back 5-10 years, that was it seemed like every year he had a top contender for these races.
Yeah, and again, I think I brought this up last week, is that, it would be easy to question the figures and say, oh, these horses just can't be this slow, but they keep running. Most of these races have a similar race for colts and often for older horses. So, as I said, the clock doesn't usually lie, and, they're running what they get, and I don't have any problem with the numbers, just not a very strong crop so far from what we've seen.
Yeah,
and it didn't get any better in the Sunland Park Oaks, which I assume we're going to move to now.
You took the words right out of my mouth. The same thing happened on Sunday. And this race, if anything, I thought you maybe were generous with the figure, because this race could have been slower. Chasing yesterday, she didn't put forth her best effort here. I think that's safe to say. And some of that may have had to do with the start, because watching the race, they have that weird ground level shot that's hard to tell. It's hard to gauge perspective on how slow she really did break, but it seemed like she was off a good 2 to 3 lengths slowly, as she did kind of rear coming out of the gate. That compromised her, because she had to get a very wide run into the clubhouse turn and was wide for her entire trip thereafter. That said, wasn't she supposed to beat this field with more ease and open up late? I just didn't like the visual impression I got from her coming down the stretch.
Yeah, I remember looking at the past performances for this race. The first thing I said is, this is one of the biggest mismatches on paper I've seen in a long time in a stakes race. I mean, there just looked like there was virtually no way she could lose, short of something happening like we saw at the fairgrounds with an injury or a Lasix or bleeding issue or something like that. And turned out it was right. I mean, she did have a pretty bad trip, but the 97, I mean, this route was lumped in with all the others on the card, Escape Clause, who we'll talk about. So, I don't think it's possible maybe it's a little bit too high, but I think it's probably right in the ballpark. But just not impressed. I thought even despite the wide trip, I mean, she was 1-9 in here when she made the move on the turn. I figured she was just going to pull away from him in the stretch, and it just didn't happen. I believe it was one of the local horses, KP Slickum, who ran second, and just not a whole lot here. I mean, if you didn't like the Fairground Oaks, then you really couldn't like this race.
No, I totally agree. And looking at past performances of the other fillies, the local fillies that were finishing behind her in this race, I don't think any of them had broken a 90 TimeformUS speed figure on the dirt coming into this race, which is not it's not too good for chasing yesterday. A lot of them did break that 90 barrier in this race, but I don't know how you take her moving forward. Maybe she'll break better and run a faster race next time out without that adversity in the opening quarter mile. But it's hard to use that as the excuse, because she got right into the race thereafter. And I suppose some ground loss cost her a length or maybe a few lengths, 2 or 3 lengths, because she was very wide around the first turn. But a horse like her out of the Bob Baffert barn against an overmatched group like this is supposed to be running a lot faster. I just don't know what to make of her coming out of this race, because her 2-year-old form was pretty strong. It's just another poor performance by one of the fancied runners in this division that makes the Kentucky Oaks picture even more confusing.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add too is, not breaking well. And like you said, the view is horrible on the replays from Sunland. They do, to their credit, they do post them on YouTube for every race, I believe, which is great. But yeah, that view they use is just terrible. It's hard to get a good read, but you don't want to see your horse not breaking well at this time of year, especially going into a race like the Derby or Oaks, because that's almost surely a death sentence.
Yeah, I agree. And I wish that we could kind of sum up these races and come out with more concrete observations moving forward. But I don't know. I don't know how I feel about any of these races, any of these horses in the grand scheme of things. I'll just say that I'm interested to see the Florida Derby next weekend and the preps following that, because I hope they can provide more clarity than we've been getting. Because the one positive that I can take out of all of this is the Kentucky Oaks and the Kentucky Derby should be really fun races to handicap, because I can imagine horse players having a variety of legitimate opinions entering those races with no clear favorites establishing themselves.
Yeah, I'm hoping the same for the Florida Derby, but it seems like the last few weeks we keep looking for clarity and it just gets more and more clouded. So we shall see. I think it's a way more talented group lining up in the Florida Derby. I haven't looked at the Oaks yet to see. That's usually a bit of a weaker race, but the Derby is one I'm definitely looking forward to. And I think Dubai's also that week, but I don't think we're going to find much coming out of Dubai. So Florida is going to be my main focus.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing those races next week because I know we're both very interested to see how Hidden Scroll performs in the Florida Derby. Moving on to the undercard races from the Fairgrounds and Sunland Park on Saturday and Sunday. One race that there was a lot of discussion about at the Fairgrounds on Saturday was the New Orleans Handicap. Because the time of this race compared to the time of the Louisiana Derby, both races run at 1.125 miles. It was not what you would expect, to say the least. This race went significantly slower than the Louisiana Derby, and I think it put speed figure makers in a really difficult position because you have to make a choice about whether or not to take the time at face value. You and your team decided to make the figure what the time indicated it should be. Just from a mathematical perspective, the speed figure makes sense within the rest of the card. It's something that I think is worth discussing, though, because you could have easily gone the other way.
I could have. And, I forgot to mention it with the Louisiana Derby. Unfortunately, that race something happened with the timer. The timing didn't work. So I did go to video and time that race because obviously when it came out to say it was 2 seconds faster than New Orleans Handicap with Core Beliefs, a horse who was, a good 3-year-old, you would expect him to run a faster or at least as fast time as the 3-year-olds ran. And it came out, I think it was about 2 seconds slower. So my immediate reaction was there's no way this hand time's right for the Louisiana Derby. Just based on the New Orleans Handicap. But I did go back and I timed the race. And to the credit of whoever did the hand timing there, and somebody on Twitter did tell me the name. I don't want to mess it up and get it wrong, but you can find it there. Whoever did it just did an outstanding job. I don't know if they used video or what they did, but every call is pretty much spot on with what I got from video. So I had no problem using the times from that race for the Derby. And then, I also timed the other routes and they look good and the Derby fit with the others. And it turned out the real stickler here was the New Orleans Handicap and just why was this race so slow? And like you said, it really makes no sense when you pull up our chart and look at the figures. All the top horses are just dropping way off. There wasn't a crazy fast pace or a crazy slow pace. And I easily could have went the other way and just said, I'm breaking this race out. And actually, my assistant does the Fairgrounds. But he does a good job. We do things the same way, basically. And we did these separately and came to the same conclusion, which is why I went with it this way. And but, not to go on too long on this, but, I don't think there really is a right answer. It's just kind of you got to go with what you feel is the right thing to do. One of the main reasons I didn't want to do it is because of the previous race in the mine shaft, where I basically did break the race out, a race we discussed at length on the podcast. But in that case, I had a reason. The pace was so slow that it made sense that the final time is affected. And the reason, the big reason I made this call is I just didn't want to double down on basing figures off projections from a race that already had a cloud over it. So that was the big reason I decided to go with the clock here. If these horses run back, am I going to bet them off those numbers? I don't know. It just kind of depends on what the odds are and who they're in against.
Yeah, I've got to say, I appreciate that explanation, and I think it's really enlightening to hear it. And I have total respect for your judgment call on this. I have to say, I wouldn't agree with this decision. Just as a handicapper, for me, speed figures first and foremost are a handicapping tool. And while I appreciate the desire to have it mathematically make sense, it's not a number that has any utility. And I think that's really hard. It's hard to defend that it does, because even considering that the mine shaft might not be a reliable figure in the prior race, I believe we gave it the P designation as a race that was a speed figure that was adjusted for pace. But even let's laying that aside for a second, just looking at all of the horses running back from their prior numbers, the average drop off for all 9 horses in the race from their prior TimeformUS speed figure was 21 points, which is kind of ridiculous. And just taking out Mr. Buff, who was eased in the race, and Bandu, who ran on turf the time before, I get that those might not be really reliable indicators of how they should have run on the dirt in this race. But even taking them out of the equation, the drop off was 16 points. So I just feel like this number is going to be a little bit misleading to handicappers moving forward that are using it. So for me, it's just hard to. I would have liked to see a number that's representative of the horses. That's just something that I always would prefer to see, even when it's a number seems too high. I like to know that a number is true without doing the work of digging through the form and seeing how the horses ran in prior starts. And I think that we have these question mark figures in the designations. I think the B for the breakout would really apply to this race because you break a race out for different reasons, but sometimes there is no reason. And we both know that tracks can change throughout a day. Sometimes they get faster or slower for no reason. And we don't really know what's going on. And you'd like to find a reason, but you do find weird situations like this where the track just got slower or a race went really slow for some reason. I was kind of looking at the internal fractions of this race to find some reason why they might have run so slowly. The pace really did slow down around the far turn as Mr. Buff and Noble Indy were just kind of stopping on the lead, and it seemed like the other riders were reluctant to pass them too soon. But that's not a reason that the race would have gone 2 seconds too slow. Maybe that would have accounted for a few fifths. But it's hard to find a reason. It's as a handicapper, I like to see a speed figure that's representative of the horses in the race.
Yeah, I definitely get that perspective. And like I said, it was a tough call. We got together as a team. That's what we decided to do. But it's certainly one I'll monitor as we go forward. Hopefully some of these horses will run back pretty soon. And as you know, I'm not averse to changing a figure. That was something I saw that like Andy Beyer did, and he got some grief for it for the winner of the Derby. By my standards, he upgraded his maiden win, I think, by, 8 or 9 points, something like that. But I really don't have a problem with that. Speed figures, once a race is over, what difference does it make if you change it? These horses are going to run back. A lot of people don't like to say, well, yeah, I bet this horse and he was 100, and now he shows up as 110. But to me, that race is over and done with. You want the most accurate information for the next race. So it's certainly something I'll keep an eye on, and we'll see how these horses do coming back.
Yeah, one of the things that really frustrates me about these, let's call them speed figure deniers, is they say, oh, well, you're cheating by adjusting the speed figure after the fact. Like, oh, you got it wrong, as if there's some right answer that's we're just ignoring by making the numbers different. No, it's there's some gray area sometimes with making these figures, as I'm sure you would say. There's no right answer, and I think this race is a good example of that. And the best. The way to make the speed figures the best handicapping tool they can be is to take a look back sometimes and see if they make sense. And you want to present horse players with an accurate number, a number that will be a predictive tool moving forward. And I think by looking back and adjusting numbers in retrospect, that's a way to do that. And it's a service to horse players if you do take those steps.
Yeah, no, one thing I'd say, I don't think the horse playing community as a whole would take very kindly to it. But, if I had my way and I had the time to do it, I think the very best speed figures you could make would be under constant revision. You would, not only use the data you had, but as you got more and more data as horses ran back, maybe every once a month you go back and have an algorithm that can adjust them, and horse players wouldn't want to hear that. But in the long run, I honestly think that would be the ultimate way to make speed figures. You make an initial one and then you constantly revise them for, maybe the next 10 or 15 run backs or whatever the number would turn out to be. But I think that would be the way to go. But it would be awful time consuming. You would definitely need a computer to do it. And I'm not sure how readily accepted it would be.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to make more work for yourself. I think you're pretty stretched to the limit as it is. But I agree with you. The speed figures should be dynamic in that sense. And I think with the really important numbers and races that are very high profile, I think you and Beyer does a very good job of taking a look back at the races to make sure that they're predictive tools that the handicappers can use moving forward. The race that got the highest TimeformUS speed figure of the weekend, speaking of speed figures, was the Muniz Memorial, which was also run in the Louisiana Derby undercard. And that was earned by Bricks and Mortar, who was the heavy favorite who got pretty lucky to win a bob because he really eked it out over a huge long shot. I believe the runner-up for Mike Maker was 62-1. That was Mark It Off, who was the pace setter in this race. But Bricks and Mortar got the job done and kind of retains his status as indisputably the leader of the older male turf division right now.
Yeah, he won the Pegasus turf race really nicely last time with a 129. And this was a bit of a weird race in that I think a lot of the speed scratched out early. I think 9 were originally entered and 3 horses scratched. And it just so happened that they were all horses that had some speed. And it would have been tough for anybody to predict Mark It Off on the lead, in my opinion. It was kind of wide open. I mean, I guess he had as good a shot as anybody after the scratches, but just a really interesting race. And this is one where it's kind of good to know. I do keep a baseline for all the different setups, the rail settings and the run-ups. So the figures look pretty slow. And, I'm not arguing that they were fast. They weren't fast, but I would just say they were average for this distance and the way the course was playing. If you look at our pace figures, they basically stay the same throughout the race. So it was just an even race, and that's kind of based on what all the other races have been run through the years at this distance. I don't think there was a temp rail, come to think of it, just off the top of my head. So using that 0 rail setting at the fairgrounds, these were legitimate for fractions. Maybe to the eye, when I saw them 51, I thought maybe that's crawling, but it just seems to be the way these races are run at the fairgrounds at this distance. Visually, it did look slow, but I would just say it was a moderate pace, but they did have trouble running down the big favorite. It was a head bob. He actually got a good bob and almost won the race at, as you said, at 60+1. Solid effort. I don't think that's what Bricks and Mortar wants, to be sitting right up there on the lead, right off the pace setter. So I'm not going to hold just winning by a nose against him. I think he'll do better with some more pace and racing covered up.
Yeah, I was curious to ask you about the pace of this race because I noticed that the pace figures indicate that the pace was relatively moderate. And as you were alluding to, from a visual standpoint, just looking at the fractions, but also looking at how the race unfolded, you would have assumed that the pace was extremely slow because Bricks and Mortar was very close to the pace, and that huge long shot who led the entire way almost held on to win. And a horse like Synchrony coming from off the pace was really compromised, you would have thought. But the pace compared to other races at the distance, as you were saying, was not slow. To me, it's interesting to look at the fairgrounds times on the turf because to me, it's just, without looking at pace figures, it's almost impossible to make sense of them most of the times. You just see a huge disparity between different distances and what's a fast pace and what's a slow pace. I just can't ever know without looking at pace figures because you do see incredibly slow fractions at certain distances on the turf at that fairgrounds course, and sometimes it's not what it appears to be.
Yeah, and one of the unique things about the fairgrounds is they just call all their races about whatever the distance happens to be. So you never really know how far the race is exactly. And part of that is they don't time the races separately. Like on the NYRA circuit, when the rail's out, they adjust the system, and they don't always get that right either, but that's another story for another day. Well, they're actually timing for the exact distance, whereas the fairgrounds, they use the same set of sensors. So if the rail's at 0 and it says about a mile, it might be a real 1 mile race. And then other times the rail could be at, 28 feet and the rail's, you'd have to do the math to figure out exactly how much it is, but they're running a mile plus whatever distance the rail adds around the turn. So it's definitely a unique track, which is why I really try to stick to the baselines that I've established. It is tough at the fairgrounds because they use a gazillion different rail settings. I mean, I'll look at my thing and they'll have 1, 5, 6, 7. It's like every foot they'll have a different setting. So I kind of group them for that track. It's the only real way you can do it. A bit of a nightmare for handicappers, but you just do the best you can.
That's really interesting, and it kind of makes sense of what you see on flashing up on the screen, because the fractions often do seem incredibly slow for different distances, and the fact that they time the races that way, that does make a lot of sense. I wasn't aware that it worked that way. This race, from a visual standpoint, I do think you have to kind of evaluate it as a race that featured a relatively slow pace because that is how it unfolded. And I do think a horse like Synchrony was negatively affected by the pace or just the race flow. And Bricks and Mortar, I don't think this was his A effort, but he had a right to take a step in the wrong direction off that impressive Pegasus win. And I don't think this is any kind of negative sign moving forward for him. He's a horse that, if anything, a mile and an eighth is probably as far as he wants to go. So I'm not going to. He did win the Pegasus going a mile and 3/16 very impressively, but I think a mile and an eighth is really the perfect distance for him, and I think he'll be really tough if he shows up in that race on the Kentucky Derby undercard moving forward.
Yeah, he will be, no doubt. I think usually have a little cut in the ground, which I don't think he'll mind at all. He's run pretty well on that before, and it's just. I hate to always sing the praises of Chad Brown, but wherever he shows up, the horse is going to be ready to run.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. The other turf race that I want to talk about from the fairgrounds on Saturday was the New Orleans Ladies, which was won by Beau Recall, who has been a new horse in the Brad Cox barn. Maybe it's just the softer competition that's allowing her to win races, but she had kind of been stuck as a graded stakes horse in California that was picking up checks, but not really winning races. And she's now won 2 of her last 3 starts at the fairgrounds. I thought she was very visually impressive winning this race because while the pace was on the moderate side, it wasn't a fast pace. She was the only horse to make any kind of closing move in the stretch whatsoever. And she just inhaled the leaders and won, to me, a little bit easier than the half-length margin would indicate.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely looked more visually impressive than the 116 she ran. And if you look at the flow, the 2, 3, 4 finishers were the top 3 early. So she was the only horse that made any real kind of move, as you say. I believe she's a horse that was offered for sale but didn't meet a reserve, and that's how she wound up back on the track. I think she was scheduled to be retired, and she seems to have found a new lease on life. Maybe it's a little bit less competition, though I'm not a huge fan of the California turf division, to be honest. So, I don't know if it's a lot less competition or maybe the ground's just different. She likes it a little more. But, whatever it is, it looks like she's also pointing to Churchill from what I've read, and I think she'll be a factor.
Yeah, I think the Distaff Turf Mile is a great spot for her. We'll see who Chad Brown brings out of the woodwork to run in that race because he's got a lot of bullets to fire. I don't know if they're all going to make that race. But if the race comes up on the weaker side, I think Beau Recall is a horse that you would definitely have to consider because I do think she's been facing some inferior competition at the fairgrounds this winter. But I like the way that she's been able to win races. I thought she was visually impressive this day, and she could just be a horse that's hitting her best stride for the new barn. Sticking with the fillies at Sunland Park on Sunday, we saw Escape Clause win the Harry Henson very impressively. I believe this was another track record that was set on Sunday. This race and the Sunland Park Derby both featured track record performances. Kind of like the Sunland Park Oaks with Chasing Yesterday, there was just no real competition for Escape Clause in this race. And unlike Chasing Yesterday, she just decimated this field.
She did. I mean, what a cool story she is. I mean, I can remember when she was running back at Century Downs and Assiniboine Downs, and I would make the figures and kind of scratch my head and go, can this be right? I had to look back and check all the races, and some of those are those places are not the most reliable for timing races. I think Assiniboine still hand times all their races. Century Downs was a new track that had a lot of issues with the timer. They're moving to a new facility for the meet this year, so I expect it's going to be better. But she was winning by so many lengths and winning in, stakes company with decent purses. And, it turned out the figures were just fine. She shipped to Southern California and she ran, immediately ran well. They tried her on turf, and as soon as they put her on dirt, she started running as fast or faster than she had at some of those Canadian tracks. And just a really cool story. I mean, she's a win machine and the kind of horse I love to root for.
Yeah, she's just kind of like the little engine that could. She doesn't seem like the most impressive filly from a visual standpoint, and she doesn't have the prettiest way of going if you watch her action, but she just keeps on running. And if anything, I think she wants more distance, not less distance. I know they took a shot with her in that, I believe it was the Santa Monica going 7 furlongs at Santa Anita back a couple months ago, but To me, I would focus on longer races with her because I think she's done best in longer dirt races or turf races. And there are plenty of mile and an eighth, mile and a quarter races out there that I think would really suit her. I know she just won a mile on this day, but she really showed a lot of finishing power going this distance. The pace wasn't that fast, but and I know you'd have to take the times with a little bit of skepticism at Sunland Park, but she did run her final quarter on this day in 23 and 1/5 seconds, which over any surface is really moving. And she was doing it in hand. So she's a filly or a mare, I should say, that I would want to see going longer distances in the future.
Yeah, maybe that was the thinking with putting her on turf. I'm not sure. And she did run she ran fine on turf, but I think she's proven that dirt's going to be her best surface for sure. But she is versatile, and you think she can go further. You're much better at that kind of stuff than me. So she'll be a fun horse to watch all year, and I look forward to seeing where she shows up next.
Moving on to some other tracks, we'll close out the podcast today with a bunch of sprint races that I think are worth a discussion. The Hutchison at Gulfstream Park on Saturday is a race that I think is worth spending a little bit of time on because it has implications for the Florida Derby next weekend. And while it was just a 4-horse field and certainly not the strongest graded stakes race we're ever going to see, Gladiator King did come out of that insane speed duel with Hidden Scroll in the Fountain of Youth to win this race, cutting back to 6 furlongs. And Gladiator King, I know he's had a lot of chances and he doesn't always show up, but when they focus on shorter sprint races with him, he's pretty dangerous.
He is. And I mean, I found it amazing this horse was 12-1 against this group. I mean, I think it's a grade 2 or grade 3. I don't remember off the top of my head. But when I saw he was running and I looked at the past performances, and I think Todd Pletcher had a horse in there that was odds on favorite, but just didn't have very good figures at all. I think it barely hit the 100 mark. And I saw the first thing I looked for was to see who the rider was. And I saw it was a rider change from the Florida Derby. And I just couldn't believe this horse was 12-1 in a 4-horse field, no less, was just the rank outsider. And I put it on Twitter. I don't want to be one of those guys tooting my horn, but as soon as I saw it, I was like, this makes no sense. You almost have to just bet this horse on the rider change alone. And this horse didn't just win. I mean, he just destroyed the field. I mean, he won as easy as could be. He got a nice 113 TimeformUS speed figure, which stacks up pretty well against the sprinters we've seen so far. And, with some better management, I mean, given the way this guy handles his horses, he'll probably show up in the Florida Derby entries on Saturday. So I don't want to get too excited about him. But for now, if they kept him to sprinting, he's a serious horse.
I think he's a great example of how to focus on relevant speed figures. And when you're looking at TimeformUS PPs and you look at the preview screen, you see in the middle of the list of the field, there's the spotlight figure for each horse. And I think it's really instructive to look at that sometimes, especially when you have a horse that's been running in all different types of spots. That spotlight figure can highlight how they last ran going today's conditions. And I think it was important with Gladiator King to just kind of ignore all of those route races, all of those races at distances beyond 6 furlongs, because if you sift through his entire list of efforts, I believe he's now made 12 starts, in his 5 races going 6 furlongs or less, regardless of surface, he's won 4 of them. And he's run speed figures that would have made him competitive with this field. So, I mean, not to red board because it's not a race that I handicapped or touted Gladiator King in. But sometimes people just ignore these horses because they're coming off a loss in a spot that didn't really suit them. And I think you have to look for where did they run their relevant speed figures, and does that apply to today? And can it make them an overlay? And I think that was the case with Gladiator King. And just to tie it back to the Florida Derby for a second, I saw a lot of people after the Fountain of Youth criticizing Hidden Scroll for dueling with a hopeless long shot on the front end and kind of diminishing his performance because he put away a horse like Gladiator King as opposed to a horse like Improbable or a horse that was established on the Derby trail. To me, it's irrelevant who he put away. He ran the fractions that he did, and you have to look at things like pace figures, and they indicate that. Gladiator King is one of the fastest horses in the country over 4 furlongs. So to me, it's extra credit to Hidden Scroll that he was able to outrun a horse like that. It doesn't matter that Gladiator King is not going to be winning graded stakes races going a mile and a 16th. That's just kind of irrelevant to the discussion. So, I mean, you might want to move up Hidden Scroll because Gladiator King won this grade 3 stakes race next time out. But to me, that's not really important. It's more of a handicapping lesson on how to assess Gladiator King, not really relevant to how you would assess Hidden Scroll.
Yeah, and one of the things you find, we don't see it too much anymore in the Derby, but like we saw it in Rachel Alexander's Preakness, and we saw it in some older versions of the Derby. If you really want to see what a fast pace that's just going to kill horses on the lead, put a true sprinter in a route race and see what they do. I forget who the horse was Rachel dueled with. I know he wound up winning a Breeders' Cup, if memory serves right. The name's escaping me, but won the Breeders' Cup Sprint. Not saying Gladiator King is a Breeders' Cup Sprint horse, but this is a serious sprinter. And when you put a sprinter in a route race and you find yourself dueling with them, it is about as tough as trip as you're going to find up on the front end.
Yeah, I completely agree with that assessment. Another horse that turned back in distance from a route race, a Derby prep, on Saturday was Great Attempt in the Gazebo at Oaklawn Park. And while this wasn't quite as fast as Gladiator King's Win and the Hutchison, I thought Great Attempt looked good in this Gazebo. The relatively slow pace contributed to a slower TimeformUS speed figure, but he finished up strong. And to me, he's really more of a one-turn horse moving forward, and I hope they focus on those races.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear after this effort. The two prior efforts at Oaklawn, he just didn't belong. I can't knock him for giving him a shot. Everybody's going to get a little bit of Derby fever and trying him at a mile. I think they were both mile races. No harm done, as he showed. He came back and won easy. Like you said, a little bit of an easy trip, clear lead. We'll have it coded in blue, the pace figures. But solid. His final time figure was a 1:10, which isn't too far behind what we just talked about with Gladiator King. His final time was actually a point higher, but Gladiator King got a few points for the fast pace. So, solid 3-year-old sprinter, and he'll probably show up in a stake next.
Yeah, another sticking with the 3-year-old sprinters for a minute. Some of the fillies that we saw last weekend were in the Cicada at Aqueduct. Workaholic for Run Happy's connections shipped in from out of town and put in a big performance for her, winning this race at 36-1. Kind of surprising looking at her prior form. She is a real traveler. I think this was her 8th different racetrack that she was running at, but she delivered, whereas some others did not. She was probably helped a little bit by a faster pace, but she earned a 100 TimeformUS speed figure, which is respectable for this division. We'll see where they go from here with her, but it's just a cool story.
Yeah, it's when I saw the name Laura Wallers, I almost couldn't believe it. See her winning a stake race in New York. I mean, I didn't even pay attention to the race, to be honest, until I just happened to tune in and it came up on TVG and I said, oh, a stake. Let me look at it. Saw Laura Wallers horse and couldn't believe it. And then she won. But looking at the past performances, it's not like she was a rank outsider. I'm not sure she really should have been 36-1 in here. Her speed figures were right there with the 6-5 favorite. I think had run 100 last time. She ran a 96. Her prior races were over a synthetic track at Turfway, which, by the way, I did look it up. Laura Wallers has won some races there because I wasn't sure she had won any since Run Happy, but she has won some races at Turfway with this horse and some others. So solid race, not a great speed figure, 100 for the winner. It was tightly bunched at the end, so take from it what you will. I'm not too excited about any of these, but I just say a cool story to see Run Happy's trainer in the winner's circle.
Yeah, I agree with that. And your assessment is pretty much spot on. Her speed figures didn't make her impossible in this race. It's just you feel like you normally see horses coming in from out of town or lesser circuits coming to New York and just not repeating their out of town figures. That just seems like a common theme. This horse was one of the few that was the exception to the rule, and she actually improved coming to the tougher circuit. And it happens from time to time with these younger horses that can take steps forward and mature. And that's what happened here. I thought the runner-up ran the better race. It's Imperial for Jason Service. She's been in a couple of tough spots recently, setting a fast pace in the Ruthless in her prior start when she was kind of against a bias. Again here, she ran the better race. She actually fell after the wire, but was just it was from exhaustion, and she was actually okay. It's just wanted to mention that because I hopefully will see her again in the future because she did run pretty well in this spot. Another notable 3-year-old performance going back to Friday was for Malpais in the Fairgrounds allowance race. This was going 6 furlongs. Just wanted to mention this race because I thought this horse was really visually impressive in victory, kind of like Great Attempt. Some of it might have had to do with the pace situation because he was able to kind of dominate on the front end. But this is a horse that had shown ability in prior starts, and he's another one that focusing on sprint races will really be to his benefit.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. His running line's almost identical to Gray Attempts, other than he had a little more pressure. But from the speed figure perspective, they're virtually identical. He got the same 105, knocked down a little bit from the slope from a 111 due to the slow pace. But again, he's a 3-year-old, should probably going to be kept sprinting, I would think. He wasn't even the favorite in this race. That went to the runner-up Distant Shore, who ran a 99 here. That was one that was a little puzzling to me from a speed figure perspective, how that horse was 4-5. But solid effort, and it's again another one like we mentioned with Gray Attempt. He's probably headed to some sprint stakes coming up.
A horse that's definitely going to be stakes bound following an allowance win on Friday is Lyrical Lady, who won at Oaklawn Park. This is a filly that was well meant at Saratoga last summer. I believe she was over a $600,000 2-year-old sale purchase, and she debuted, I believe, it was back in July at Saratoga. It was one of the first couple of weekends. She was really impressive that day, then got cooked in a fast pace in the Adirondack next time out. Has not been seen since then until last Friday, and boy, was she impressive winning this race. I'm not going to be surprised if she's one of the favorites for the 8 Bells in her next start.
Yeah, a big 115 TimeformUS speed figure in here. She beat the highly regarded Brill, who was shipping in from Southern California. Brill was all the talk at Del Mar, I believe it was, over the summer. Won her first out and then kind of disappointed after that. But both the top two ran very well, in my opinion. Lyrical Lady was clearly best. She set a fast pace. She just outran Brill. But Brill hung on well, as also got that 109, and she was in the chase position, which is one I'm not really a big fan of when you're the lone horse chasing a lone leader, but she held strong. So I think, as you said, this is going to turn out to be a really strong allowance race for the class. They ran much faster than what we saw from our 3-year-old Oaks preps, for example, albeit in the sprint. But these are some talented fillies. I like seeing Lyrical Lady come back off that layoff. You never know what's going to become of a 2-year-old filly that spent some time on the bench, but she certainly came out very strong and looks like a serious racehorse.
Yeah, kind of did a double take, making sure this wasn't actually a stakes race, because it really was a stakes quality allowance field. And I just loved the way Lyrical Lady set those fractions. It wasn't a fast pace, but she was moving up front, and she was just doing it with so much ease. And she really kicked away in the stretch. Like you were saying, this was a really impressive win. And Brill for Jerry Hollendorfer shipped in from California. And I think that's something we've been seeing a little bit of with trainers that are based in California, shipping out to other circuits like Oaklawn Park, because they need spots to run their horses that are ready to run. And Brill was ready to come off the layoff in this race, and I thought she put in a decent effort. She was, as you were saying, she was well regarded last summer. I believe she was actually the favorite in the Del Mar debutante. She didn't really perform in either of those Grade 1 attempts last year, but this was a good starting point for her, and she's one that may want to go farther in the future. So I think both of these horses could do well coming out of this race. And speaking of horses coming in from California, we saw a really fast effort from Captain Scotty in a Sunday allowance race. I know this was a race that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, it kind of jumped out at me. I have some flags set in my program if if certain figure level gets reached for the class, and this one jumped out. I mean, not that it was overly crazy fast. He got a 121 for the win, but he won very easily. He's another that shipped in from California for trainer Peter Miller. He won very easily, won by almost 7 lengths. And what jumped out at me is just watching the race, not so much how easy he won, but he faced pressure. He was inside. It was basically a 3-horse duel for almost half a mile. And that's a tough trip. You don't often see horses just shake off the other two from the rail and draw away like he did. He was also, I believe, and this is always tricky to go by this, but I think he was a first-time gelding. He was listed as being gelded back in February and didn't show up into the races till mid-March. So it kind of fits the time frame. So that was what intrigued me, seeing the first-time gelding. The visual matched the big number. I don't think it was an easy trip. He was 2-5 in here, so I'm not acting like he was beating Breeders' Cup sprint horses, but really solid effort. And I would expect to see this one maybe on Arkansas Derby Day if they're going to keep him here, or maybe in some of the big sprints coming up at Santa Anita.
Yeah, he's a horse that has run fast races in the past. This was one of his faster speed figures, I believe, of his entire career. He did start off his career with a bang. I think he was 2 for 2 in his first couple of races, and then was, I believe, 2-1 against City of Light in the Triple Bend last year before just seeming to go slightly off form. He was second in a bunch of races coming into this, and seemed like he put it all together. If he was indeed a first-time gelding in this race, that could have made a big difference for him. I agree. He could be a graded stakes horse moving forward. We'll see if they stay with him on the East Coast or if they bring him back to California for future races. But it was a good effort by him. One of the faster speed figures we saw this past weekend, where we didn't see a ton of really, high speed figures going back to Saturday, Friday, and Sunday. Any of those 120 plus numbers, and he was one of the top ones.
He was, and yeah, I always look forward to that. When the gelding thing, it doesn't always work. I think people overbet it as a handicapping figure. It's kind of like blinker changes. When they work, everybody points to them. But if you run the numbers, it's not really a great move. But when it does work, it's worth following because, maybe this horse has a new lease on life. He figured, they figured something out with him, and he definitely has shown talent all along, and he really put it all together. So maybe he's ready for another hike back up the class ladder.
Well, we're going to leave it at that this week, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing the upcoming prep races with you, as we were alluding to earlier. I'm really looking forward to the Florida Derby this upcoming weekend. I guess we can also discuss some of the races from Dubai on the next show. I don't think we'll have speed figures for those races, but there are some U.S. horses running there, and also the other Derby preps coming up at Keeneland and Santa Anita, hopefully, as well as Aqueduct. I hope that they provide more clarity on the Derby picture, and we'll see some horses that we've talked about previously in action. So I'm looking forward to discussing all of that in the future. And catch us next week. You can listen to us, as always, on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud. Just search for the Daily Racing Form channel, and we're the TimeformUS Pacecast. So check us out in the future. Craig, thanks again, and we'll see you next week.